Hi, everyone. I'm Kyle Bechet, and this is the AAF Exchange, a podcast from the American Action Forum where experts provide clear, data-driven insight into today's economic and domestic policy issues. Welcome, and thank you for tuning in. On this podcast, we will discuss the 3 things Congress must do by the end of this year, the long-term budget outlook, and a little bit about what it is like to testify before Congress. Joining us will be Gordon Gray, the Director of Fiscal Policy here at the American Action Forum. Gordon, thank you for joining us today.
Sure thing. Thank you for having me.
So, we know Congress isn't likely to tackle anything new before the next presidential election, but there are a number of outstanding tasks that absolutely have to get done. Can you give us a rundown of what those are?
Sure. There are essentially 3, and the last one is actually more of a grab bag of sort of smaller priorities that just need some kind of congressional attention. But the first 2 are pretty significant and substantial. I'll address them sort of chronologically. The first one is the debt limit. We have already reached the statutory debt limit, and now Treasury is deploying conventionally have been called their extraordinary authorities, this sort of bag of accounting tricks that the Treasury gets to use so that we can pay our bills until essentially those authorities are run out, and then you really hit the debt limit. That'll happen sometime in the fall. But we've already sort of essentially started to have to run the clock on the debt limit. The second one is, of course, funding the federal government next year. I think everybody would hope that we avoid another government shutdown. That was just universally bad, and we shouldn't do that anymore. That's sort of the next challenge. There are a lot of considerations to observe there. The first is just we need to avoid a shutdown. The second question is, how do we think about funding priorities for the defense apparatus, national security? It's a dangerous world. Going back to essentially sequestration levels would take about $70 billion off the table for the Defense Department and other defense activities. And then you have to consider our domestic discretionary priorities. Going back to the Statutory Budget Control Act caps would take about $50 billion off the table for those programs. So that combined, you're looking at $120 billion. And those would fund, real priorities. And the other thing is that's about 0.5 percentage point of GDP. So there's some programmatic considerations, and then there's an economic component here that we shouldn't ignore, because who knows what GDP is going to look like when it comes out in July. I mean, yeah, well, my expectation is that we've got a growing economy, but there's some risk there. So policy risk is certainly one of them. So those are the first 2. And then the last is just a handful of programs that just need reauthorization.
Mm-hmm. So, yeah, let's talk about each of those a little bit more in turn. And we'll start in the same chronological order that you gave them to us with. The debt ceiling. First, give us a little bit more about what that is. Where does it come from? Why do we have to keep having this debate over the debt ceiling?
Sure. So once upon a time, about 100 years ago, Congress used to have to approve individual debt auctions. That's because the government didn't run deficits historically. And so for the federal government to go out and borrow, say in times of war, for example, was kind of a big deal. And Congress would have to go out there and actually vote on individual debt issuances. Now they happen every week. Treasury holds debt auctions all the time. So we're just in a different world. And so back in when Congress got tired of voting on them individually as we had greater borrowing needs, essentially what Congress did was say, okay, Treasury, rather than us voting on this all the time, we'll give you an allowance. And that's essentially what the debt limit was. And then as American deficit appetite grew, then we had to keep bumping up the allowance. Interestingly, in the 90s, when we were running budget surpluses, we still had to increase the debt limit because of the growing balances in the Social Security trust funds, for example. So this is something that we've just had to grapple with, even in sort of good budgetary times. So the nature of it has changed significantly over time, and it's just one of the things that you have to do so that Treasury can pay its bills. I think both parties are increasingly getting the point that you have to raise or otherwise suspend the debt limit. It's costly to the federal government if we monkey around with it. There's a whole bunch of other risks. that attach to not increasing the debt limit. So my hope and expectation is that this will be drama-free. So we'll see. But the debt limit has changed significantly over time. Historically, it's always been a kind of a hot potato politically. Nobody wants to vote for this. It just looks bad.
Right.
The public doesn't, for good reason, know sort of the history and the operation of this. So it just sounds like you're being fiscally irresponsible when the reason you have to raise the debt limit is because of decisions that have already been made. The debt's growing irrespective of what limit we artificially put on it. And it's growing for policy reasons that were in policy, changes in policy, laws, policies put in place that well preceded any debt limit vote. So it's just one of those things Congress is going to have to do.
Has this debt limit ever actually helped control federal spending, or is it just sort of one of those mechanisms?
Well, actually, you know what? Let me couch that in the debt limit itself doesn't constrain policy choices because those choices are made before the debt limit has to be increased. However, the legislating a new debt limit increase has historically often involved deficit reduction deals. So certainly in the 80s and 90s, a lot of the big deficit reduction packages were part of debt limit legislation. So this is Grant-Rudman, the 1990 budget deal, 93 budget deal, and some others, all involved debt limit standoffs as well. So the tradition of debt limit increases has often been one that includes deficit reduction. That's one of the reasons why folks are sometimes reluctant just to get rid of the debt limit altogether. Notwithstanding some of the challenges I already sort of talked about, is that it is one of the few times when Congress seems to have actually grappled with the budget overall. Congress doesn't usually do that, right? We don't pass comprehensive budgets. Most of what Congress actually decides is an increasingly smaller share of the federal budget that's discretionary spending. So one of the reluctances of just junking the debt limit altogether is because it is one of those times when you kind of force Congress to have to deal with this.
Mm-hmm. It forces them into action. So when can we expect something to actually move on the debt limit?
So one problem with the debt limit outlook now is that projecting cash flows in the federal cash flows is tricky. This is billions and billions and billions of dollars. And right now the projections are suggesting that we won't have to increase the debt limit without risking default until maybe fall. So right around the end of the fiscal year, when presumably there'll be another discussion going on about funding the federal government. But the projections for when we're going to run out of room, essentially, for the debt limit we keep getting more time, or we're told that we have more time. Anytime you tell Congress that they don't have to do something today, you're sort of encouraging the worst behavior in legislators. Why do today what you can do tomorrow?
Right. All right, so let's talk about, funding the government through the next fiscal year.
Sure, that'd be nice.
We don't seem to have real budgets anymore. I mean, I can't even tell you the last time that the process actually, the budget went through the actual process. It sounds like Congress just fights about how much to increase the defense versus non-defense spending every year, and that's really how it's framed. What's the latest on this? What is likely to happen this year?
So the latest is no significant news. The House and the Senate are both pretending like they're going to get their own figures for defense and non-defense, and so they're kind of making plans to write appropriations bills, and some have already been moving at their own sort of defense and non-defense spending levels without actually meeting in the middle. That is going to come later, and the White House is reportedly negotiating on this, but it's not obvious what their priorities are. I've heard lots of different stories in terms of the administration's approach to this. My expectation is more continuing resolutions in the fall and winter. Yet again, if Congress can let itself off the hook for making a hard decision, they will. A couple months of CRs around the holidays certainly lets Congress do that. They have a grand tradition of kicking the can down the road, and this seems like a lovely opportunity for them to do that. So I imagine they will.
I'm noticing a theme here about passing it off to the next day.
The theme of this podcast is, here's the three things. If you gave Congress an entire year to legislate, here's the handful of things they would do.
Yeah.
And it's not obvious they will do them on time. So this isn't a very high bar.
So let's talk about that third one. The host of programs that will be in funding, where the funding is expiring this year. First, what are these programs? Second, what happens if Congress fails to reauthorize them?
So there's a handful of programs, and that just their authorizations expire. First is temporary assistance for needy families. This is the modern evolution of what used to be called welfare. It is funded, but it needs reauthorization. This program was more at risk during the shutdown because it is actually funded through discretionary funding, and that had run out. And their contingency fund was in danger of being drawn down. But my sense is that this one should be fine. The flood insurance program also needs reauthorization. I understand that there's legislation to accomplish this, and hopefully this will be non-controversial. Lastly, the Ex-Im Bank is expiring at the end of the year. It looked like Congress had made progress on a compromise bill in the House Financial Services Committee, and then Chairwoman Waters had to pull the bill over the objections of her own members. So that seems to be kind of a hot mess. So, but the consequences of not funding on balance, it seems like the Ex-Im Bank may be one of those sort of necessary evils. But we've seen long periods of instability with respect to the Ex-Im Bank. It wouldn't have the same consequence as, say, not raising the debt limit or precipitating a government shutdown, for example. But it's just one of those things that will require some congressional attention, unless we expect the Ex-Im to sort of revert to its just kind of zombie mode that it was on for a couple of years.
Yeah, the Export-Import Bank always seems to be one of those kind of controversial topics out there.
Yeah, it doesn't have a lot of ideological friends, because it is one of these. It's imperfect from a sort of pure, sort of optimal economic policy standpoint, essentially subsidizing industries when presumably private finance should be doing that, and then. So there's problems from the conservatives, and then certainly there's problems from the progressives for any number of reasons. So it just doesn't have a natural ideological home. But from a pragmatic standpoint, the world is far removed from any sort of textbook explanation of markets at work. Other major trading partners have export credit agencies. So it's just one of those things. I think the U.S., like I said, a necessary evil. So long as that's the case, we should just go about authorizing this federal agency to keep doing its business.
Mm-hmm. All right, so that's what Congress needs to do. Let's switch gears for a moment and talk about what Congress should be doing. I don't think you can have a conversation about the budget without
that list is longer.
Talking about about the budget outlook. I know you've written about it. You produce those chart books every quarter for them, and it always seems to be showing that the debt is coming home, and that we have to deal with it. So, what are the key takeaways from our current fiscal situation?
So, the Congressional Budget Office, that's probably the most respected sort of budget forecasting outfit here in D.C. They're nonpartisan. Everybody uses their numbers. They just projected that the debt will reach about 1.5 times the size of the economy over basically the next 35 years. That is largely unchanged in terms of the relative magnitude of the projected debt. We have a debt problem. We're staring at this coming our way, and we're doing nothing. Like I said, it would be great if Congress made sure that we paid our bills on time and kept the government open. That's the hope of what Congress can achieve. That's a pretty low bar. None of that actually deals with the fundamental budget challenges that we have. And that's largely driven by the fact we have an older society, and we've made large commitments to their retirement and health care in retirement, and those costs are growing.
Mm-hmm. Those are the entitlement programs you're speaking of. So that's essentially how we got here, is all of these promises for Social Security and Medicare, Medicaid.
That's a complicated question. The how we got here is essentially the debt we have right now is the net result of every past fiscal decision. So the how we got here is much more complicated, and however we got here, we are here. And the future risks to the budget aren't necessarily those of the past. So some of those budget deals I talked about from the 90s, et cetera, back when people used to talk about balanced budgets and how great that was, the federal budget was a lot different, even back in the 90s. The share of federal spending devoted to entitlements was significantly smaller. The share of spending devoted to things, domestic discretionary programs, so it's, education and infrastructure and research and this, that, and the other was a bigger chunk of the federal budget, which meant Congress could actually change that on an annual basis. Now, about 2/3 of the federal budget is entitlement spending and interest. Congress can't really change that quickly. You can make benefit changes, but those to actually realistically get those through, you'd have to do them incrementally and allow those time to take hold. That's one of the changing nature of and composition of federal spending means that the solutions that worked in the past aren't going to work in the future.
Yeah, so this next question, I probably can guess the answer to it based off of our conversation about what Congress needs to do. But if this is such a big problem, why isn't anybody fixing it?
It's too hard.
Yeah.
It's not in anybody's interest to propose raising taxes and cutting spending, which is what you have to do to reduce the deficit. If you look at what was President Trump's message for his winning campaign was, I'm not touching your Social Security and your Medicare, and I'm going to give you a massive tax cut. If you look at what the left is saying, it's we're going to expand entitlements well in excess of the capacity or their proposed tax increases. So both political parties are making the argument to the American people, which is, yes, you can in fact consume way more government than you're willing to pay for. That's why we have big deficits. That's why we have debts.
So, yeah, we're clearly headed for some sort of a fiscal and economic catastrophe with this. and as you just said, nobody's doing anything because it's not politically feasible. So what's it going to take for Congress or a president or any president to do something on this?
You have to make it in the political interest of representatives to sell the solution to the American people. This is just a classic problem where you are talking about future risks. People have risks today, right? People have bills to pay. They have other concerns that are weighing on them today. And now somebody's going to come and tell them, oh, well, we're going to make your life more expensive. I get why that's not appealing. So it's not just sort of just raw irresponsibility. There are competing priorities. It's my concern, though, is just that the risks associated with running up the debt, and if we wait so long, we'll end up having significant costs for people, and in particular vulnerable populations. So it's just a difficult problem to have to basically tell people to eat your veggies.
Yeah. So in your mind, where would a good starting point be to fix some of these debt issues?
So the American Action Forum just participated in the Solutions Initiative. It's a program run by the Peterson Foundation that convened 7 think tanks from across the political spectrum to come up with solutions to address the debt. And our proposal was, I thought, a balanced proposal that involves tax reform and involves significant changes to entitlements. And we managed to get the budget into long-run balance. But it involved very difficult decisions. It involved decisions that this was the third time we did it. We do it every couple of years. It involved decisions that I didn't want to make last time around, but just waiting has made tackling the debt more difficult. CBO recently put out some numbers that show that essentially the longer you wait, the harder tackling the debt gets. If you wait just a few years, essentially the problem gets 50% harder. The relative scale of tax changes and spending changes that you would need to accomplish the same sort of budget target, that gets steeper the closer you get to that target. That's no great surprise. But when you're talking about how much more you're going to tax Americans or how much more expensive federal services are going to be, that really matters.
Yeah. So as we wrap up here, we like to talk about something, a little bit more fun and personal, just to get to know you a little bit better. One thing I found interesting is that you recently testified before Congress for the first, and then the second, and then a third time this year.
Yeah, it's been a good run.
Yeah. So the first thing I have to ask is, how do you prepare for something like that? Because sitting in front of all those members of Congress, has to be sort of a daunting task.
I have gotten very good advice from my colleagues here, particularly Doug Holtake and our president, who testifies all the time, sort of just how you kind of conduct yourself in these hearings. So I just got some very good practical advice from him, and I got great help from my other colleagues just doing sort of practice questions just so I don't publicly embarrass myself. And then the other is just in preparing your written testimony, just that whole exercise, if you sort of take it seriously, you have to, just in basically writing your statement, you're acquainting yourselves with the facts. You're having to synthesize your arguments, get supporting data. And so just the act of writing the testimony is very good preparation in my view. And the rest is just being willing to listen to the questions in good faith and be humble about the answers that you try to give Congress. So when a member of Congress asks a question, I presume that they're asking in good faith, and my job there is to give them the best answer that I can. Not to be my role in these hearings is not to be an advocate per se. It's just to provide information and data as best I can. I don't try to go there to try to argue for Congress to do something. That's kind of their job. Every single day, they have advocates in front of them telling them to do something. Mm-hmm. So my job is just to give sort of my best expert views on the subjects before the committee.
Right. So for all of us who have not had this honor to testify, what's the most surprising thing you found?
Well, I think most when I sort of talk to, of course, when I get invited to do a hearing, I of course tell my mother, and but there's sort of the practical reality of hearings. People may think, oh well, Congress is convening a hearing to get for finding of fact. And the practical reality is when you look at how a hearing plays out, most members sort of just come in, they sort of say their statement and then leave. So this isn't like a Watergate hearing or a
they're not all as contentious as like a Supreme Court hearing or something of a confirmation hearing.
When I go to these hearings, I'm a just a think tank guy, right? I come in and we talk about credit subsidy rates and things like that. I'm not somebody that any of the members really want to beat up on or anything like that. So my role in these hearings is a lot different than the kind of hearings that make the news.
Awesome. Well, Gordon, thanks for joining us today.
Hey, thanks for having me.
We hope you enjoyed this conversation. Tune back in for our next episode where our experts will provide clear, data-driven insights into today's economic and domestic policy issues. I'd also like to encourage you to check out any of the links in our show notes from this episode, and also follow us on social media to hear more about AAF.